everybody, and welcome to this video on the parabola. We will be looking at the domain and the range of the parabola in this video. So once again, our domain and range would depend on the shape of the graph. So we get two types of parabolas, one where your A is positive, your shape parameter is positive, or A is negative. And depending on which one we have, it will then dictate our domain and range. So let us have a look at the first one. So here we have that A is positive. So our parabola shape will have this shape over here. And for the domain, regardless of whether it is positive or negative, so you'll see the domain is the same in both cases, it's X is an element of real numbers. Another way to write that is that X is an element from minus infinity to positive infinity. So if you look at these arrows, they kind of go on and on and on to infinity and on to infinity. So you can imagine the smallest X value would have to be minus infinity, and the biggest X value it will take is positive infinity. The range is different though. So the range is Y is an element. The smallest value it will take in the positive graph is the minimum. So remember, in the turning point either is a minimum or maximum, and in this case here we have a minimum, and do you see there is nothing below the minimum? So the graph's range starts at the minimum and it's included, so it's square brackets, and then the arrows going up to infinity tells us that it goes to infinity. What is that minimum value that goes there? It's the Y coordinate of the turning point. Okay, so for the negative case, we have a downwards facing parabola. The domain once again is the same, because if it goes on to infinity, the smallest X value it has is negative infinity, and the biggest X value you have is positive infinity. Again, if you would like, you could write it as X is an element from minus infinity to infinity. But these two expressions are the same, so you can choose either one of them. For the range, once again, a turning point has either a parabola has a turning point, which can either be a maximum or a minimum. If your A value is negative, then you will definitely have a maximum. If again you look above the maximum, there is nothing. So that is telling us that our range does not include anything above the maximum. So our range for this case is Y is an element from negative infinity, because you see the arrows are pointing down, and the smallest value would be negative infinity. And what's the biggest Y value? It would be the maximum. Again, how do we get the maximum? It's the Y coordinate of our turning point. So we're going to need our turning point to determine what is the range. But for the domain, for either case, it's X is an element of real numbers. Let us have a look at it, some examples. So we have to find the domain and range for each one of these. So the first thing, let us say what is the shape. So A is positive in this case. So we have an upward shape, and we know the upward shape has a minimum. Okay, we do need the shape, because then it will decide which form of the range are we using. And then the next thing is we want to calculate our turning point. Now it is in turning point form, so we take the P value and we change the sign, so the -1 becomes 1, and the Q we take it as is. So we're taking the P and the Q. So now let's start with the domain. So the domain, easy, it's a parabola. The domain will be X is an element of real numbers. The range, now we think about it. So this here is, it has a minimum, so Y will be an element from the minimum. So from the minimum, and what's the minimum value? It will be the Y coordinate of the turning point, and it will go right up to infinity. Let's have a look at this one. Again, what shape does it have? The A is negative, so this time it has a downward shape and it has a maximum. We need the turning point. So what is the turning point? Again, it's in turning point form, so we just read the P and the Q value. We change the sign of P, so that +1 becomes -1, and the Y coordinate is 3. So what is our domain? you can write this very simply because the domain is always x is an element of real numbers, and now the range will depend on our case. So we have a maximum. So the smallest y value it will go through is minus infinity. And the biggest y value it will take is the maximum, which we say we get by using the y coordinate of the turning point, which is why we calculate it, and it has a square bracket. Square brackets means that the graph actually goes through that point. So it does go through the point -3. For the last one, again, we look at our A value, and our A value is negative. So we have this shape again with the maximum. And then our turning point in this case, so here it looks a bit tricky because we have x plus 4 and then it looks like there's no q, but remember we can always write +0. So our turning point is -4 and 0. So our domain, this one here you should get quite simply, is x is an element of real numbers, and our range would follow the form for -1. So y is an element from -infinity to our y coordinate of our turning point, which is 0, and it is included. So we have a square bracket. Please watch our other video on how to get the turning point, because if you do not know how to get the turning point, then writing down the range for any one of the graphs might be tricky. Also, make sure you understand the concept of the shape parameter and minimum and maximum, because that also plays a role in the domain and range. Please watch our next video for more information on the parabola.